Good morning, everyone. Today is the first day of the second tranche of hearings for Module 3, Impact of the Pandemic on Healthcare. I hope people have been able to get some kind of break in between the hearings, although I know many will have been working hard to prepare for the next few weeks. We shall begin with the second part of the Impact film. It lasts about 14 minutes, 13 minutes, 35 seconds to be precise, and it contains footage of people from across the United Kingdom talking about the impact that the pandemic had on their lives and the lives of their loved ones. The range of topics covered include COVID, pregnancy and birth, cancer treatment, and lack of or delayed treatment for other conditions, end-of-life palliative care, bereavement, and mental health. Some may therefore find the second part of the film distressing, as many of the films to date have been. So I suggest that anyone in the hearing room who wishes to leave should do so now, and those following online may wish to press pause on the recording. When the film is over, we shall reconvene, and Counsel to the Inquiry, Mr. Mills, will call the first witness of these hearings. Play the recording, please.
I look after people who are end of life, mostly in the community, and I work out of a hospice. The palliative care role all of a sudden obviously became less face-to-face work. Our business is about supporting people. I think we all felt a loss actually from not being able to do our jobs properly. And a colleague of mine's dad died on the ward, and I was there. She missed him dying, and people had to watch people die through windows. I got to be in the room and, they were in the garden. I can't imagine what that's like for them, and I know that'll never leave them.
My Patrick is my devoted partner. He dedicated his nursing career to the NHS. He tested positive on the 4th of April 2020. Whilst off sick, staff were contacting him, concerned about what was a red area or what was a green area. There was lack of clarity. He was looking grey and had a blanket around him. He couldn't stop shaking. Well, he was blue lighted to the hospital. Patrick called home. He'd had an x-ray. He'd got pneumonia in his lungs.
I lost my dad right at the very beginning of the pandemic. He'd had a very successful operation and he'd been sent to the community hospital to recuperate, and he was on track to come home at the beginning of April 2020. But I got a phone call on Saturday morning at home to say that Dad had not been very well on the Friday. He'd had a temperature. About 2 o'clock, the phone rang again, and it was the doctor. And I thought, well, that's strange, because community hospitals don't have doctors. We've had one case of COVID on the ward. And he said, the only thing is we don't have a respirator here.
My husband was a very disabled man. I had been his 24/7 carer for 12 years. By day 6 in the hospital, he still had not had an MRI scan. I was not allowed to visit him. I couldn't get to speak to a consultant on the phone, and every junior doctor I spoke to gave me a different story. The hospital phoned to tell me that in a routine test, my husband had tested positive for Covid-19 and was being moved to the COVID ward. I had kept him safe at home, and now he had caught COVID in hospital.
He was only 58 when he was diagnosed with early onset dementia. He then developed a cancerous tumour in his bowel, and unfortunately he had to go into hospital to have that removed. He was in hospital a month and he was moved 5 times, 5 different wards. He just became more and more confused. He actually thought he'd done something wrong to be locked away from us. He fell in hospital. He wasn't discovered for 45 minutes. He had COVID at that time, and he died alone on the 30th of January.
I've had severe asthma all my life. I didn't really go out of the house. The times that I did go out of the house were pretty much in relation to hospital visits. I had an infection on my knee and I had to go into hospital for it. A gentleman followed me in who'd been admitted. He was coughing, struggling with breath. About 4 hours after he'd been brought into the bay, he was taken out of the room, and one of the senior doctors came in and says, we're really sorry, you've been exposed to a patient with COVID. We were told that we were being transferred to a red zone and put into isolation, into quarantine. A while later, I ended up back in hospital. I was put in a situation where I was put on a respiratory ward. My bay that I was in, which had 4 people in it, was next to a COVID bay, and we're all on a long corridor. They were allowing COVID patients to go into the corridor. We were sharing toilets, facilities, and they were putting people with serious lung conditions in peril.
The labour kind of didn't go as planned. And I can remember going into the hospital and I had to go in by myself.
From my point of view, it's a really, really anxious time, not being able to be there to support you, and also not being party to any of the information that's being shared between you and the hospital.
But I remember when he was born, they brought him up to my chest and I had a mask on and I looked down and I couldn't see him because I had this mask on. And it was really awkward because they didn't want me to take the mask off.
So I didn't have any time to really see the baby or to make sure that you were okay. I can remember driving home and crying.
There were times, particularly through the night, where you'd push the button and no one would come. You could hear the call buttons through the night and you'd listen and think, that call button's been going for like half an hour. I hope that mum and that baby's okay. But there's nothing you can do.
At the doors of the wards, I saw, and I will never forget it, 2 people with a stretcher in full, what I would describe as hazmat suits. I couldn't even tell if they were male or female. And it absolutely frightened the life out of me. And I found out later they were undertakers. So if a private company could be prepared for something as serious as this, then why was our health board not?
It was then I was told that he'd been ventilated that morning at 6 o'clock, but nobody had informed me. I received another call from the hospital to say, Patrick's taken a turn. I arrived at the hospital, taken to the makeshift room. I said, you're not giving up on him, are you? He's one of you. And the response I got back was, if you ask 10 different doctors, you'll get 10 different answers. I wasn't aware that it was palliative care. I wasn't aware they put a DNR on Patrick. I wasn't aware because I wasn't consulted. Nobody was listening to me. I'm insignificant. I asked to see Patrick and I was donned in PPE. At that time I thought, I've got more protection than Patrick had. Patrick was then extubated and passed away in my presence.
The guilt that I feel, having promised him that I would look after him and be with him as often as I could, to see his face saying, why have you left me? I'll never forget it. And nor will our children. I just thought there was no thought given to individual circumstances or to vulnerable people.
I had to drive my own car behind my dad's hearse because we couldn't have a funeral car. You know you're going to lose loved ones, that's part of life. But you don't expect to have to drive your own car behind your dad.
They told me they could do nothing more for him. I fought tooth and nail to bring him home. And after 3.5 interminable weeks, I managed it. He was no longer able to speak by then, but he saw the garden through the window and the loving faces all around him. And he knew he was home. Then he let go. My husband had served his country well. He had been a squadron leader in the RAF, and now his country had given him this horrible death. But these were untimely deaths, deaths that should not have happened in that way at that time. There must be structures and systems in place that do the best they can for the people.
I was due to have chemotherapy. I started one session and then my chemo was stopped. I had to wait 5.5 months for it to start again. We're real people with real emotions. We're not charts, we're not graphs, we're not facts, we're not stats. We're people. And then you go and have chemotherapy. But the chemotherapy is killing your immune system. And so you're so vulnerable, because if you catch COVID, you've had it.
I was diagnosed with breast cancer. And I went from being a healthy person to suddenly being one of the vulnerable people myself, literally overnight, because I started chemo almost straight away. And I felt so supported and so protected by the NHS. And then it was, to be honest, I really noticed a shift in how serious people took COVID. There was very much an attitude of, from the staff who were all brilliant as far as cancer was concerned. I'm never going to fault them for anything they did with my cancer treatment and when I'm still here. But the general lack of awareness about COVID in hospitals just really frightened me. I didn't feel like we were protected properly. Lack of ventilation in the chemotherapy unit, about mask wearing being patchy at best.
We feel like we're still looking on the outside in. What the pandemic really showed for me was how little help there was out there for us.
In December 2001, I was in an accident while waiting for a train. Throughout the years, I've had deterioration, further injuries to the initial injuries. In 2018, I was waiting for surgery. On the 28th of February 2020, I was told that within the next 10 to 14 days, I would be called in for surgery. And of course, that call never came because the pandemic kicked in. During those 2 years, I was in so much pain. And by the time I finally saw the surgeon in 2022, I was by then completely inoperable. So I will carry the legacy of COVID for the rest of my life. I will be in pain for the rest of my life. For many disabled people like myself, we were already in lockdown and have been for years and years. All special need, disability, mental health facilities all closed, day centres closed, so that one day a week where you got to escape the house ended. And the only people you saw was your carers. They were covered from head to toe in PPE to protect them, to protect us. But it became inhuman and distant and cold. Plus the carers were so absolutely overwhelmed by additional work at the time. And you lost that human touch. I tried to get mental health care through the NHS and I couldn't get it. I was on a list, a long list. 2020, I was contacted to tell me that the next group would be starting in March and that I would be among them. Then COVID hit. I got the phone call from the same lady who told me that the entire team had been redeployed to deal with people that had been furloughed, that had just been furloughed. People like me that had waited for years for treatment were completely dropped. just felt like you were sinking further and further into darkness and irrelevant. The forgotten people.
Thank you very much. We shall resume the hearing now. Mr. Mills.
My lady, may I please call Dr. Sarah Powell?
I do solemnly declare that I will well and faithfully interpret and true explanation make of all such matters and things as shall be required of me according to the best of my skill and understanding.
I do solemnly declare that I will well and faithfully interpret and true explanation make of all such matters and things as shall be required of me according to the best of my skill and understanding.
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Your full name, please.
Sarah Catherine Powell.
Dr. Powell, you have provided a statement to the inquiry. The reference is INQ 000 421866. You are a highly specialist clinical psychologist working with deaf people.
Yes, that's correct.
You have been deaf since birth?
Yes.
And your primary language is British Sign Language?
Yes.
A little bit about your family. Your husband is also deaf and a BSL user?
Yes.
And you have 2 sons who are hearing?
Yes.
Can we begin your evidence, please, with your experience of contracting COVID-19? Take us back to the 24th of March, 2020. When did you realise that something was wrong?
It was actually my mother's birthday and I was baking brownies for her, and my son commented on the lovely smell in the house, which I couldn't smell, which seemed a bit odd. I couldn't smell anything at all, which was a shock at the time. I knew that something was wrong, but I didn't realise it was linked to COVID. So the first thing I noticed was lack of smell.
Over the next days and weeks, how did your symptoms develop?
Well, from the start, there was no smell, which continued. And then I got a sensation, a burning sensation on my tongue, which I'd never had that experience before. And I contacted the doctor, which was difficult because it was lockdown, that had started, and it was all telephone consultations. So I had to email with my GP, which was very difficult to explain what my symptoms were, particularly the burning on the tongue. They thought maybe an infection. I was given a spray, which didn't help. I was given antibiotics 3 times. And in the end, the doctor decided not to prescribe any more. So the symptoms I was having, I had pains in my leg, my arms, my joints, and I was completely worn out. And I couldn't understand what it was. My eyes felt dry. I had headaches. I couldn't name everyday objects. I remember clearly I was trying to remember the word for slippers. And I couldn't, what those things, what you wear, house shoes. I couldn't actually remember the word for slippers. So all of these things were happening to me and I didn't know what was going on and it was awful.
Can I ask, during this time, were you able to have face-to-face meetings with your GP?
No. It was either through email, because obviously I don't use a telephone, being deaf. So it was written through email, and I think twice I had to face-to-face appointments, but the doctor wore a mask, I wore a mask. Interpreters weren't allowed to attend the appointments at the time because of infection control, and only 2 people were allowed in the room at the time, so I had to write again. The doctor didn't really understand what I was trying to describe. I just felt as if I was being gaslit. It was difficult that he didn't take on board what I was trying to describe.
During those appointments, did you ask whether your symptoms were linked to COVID-19?
Yes, I did. Yes. It just seemed, prior to this, I was very healthy. I used to run. And suddenly, I couldn't do those things. I was so worn out. And at the same time, my husband had been hospitalised and he'd been, it was confirmed that he had COVID-19. So when I asked, doctor said, no, you haven't got because you've not tested positive for COVID-19. But all of the cough, the symptoms I had, such as the sense of smell, weren't the ones that people would have put down to COVID-19, such as the high temperature and the cough.
So at that time, can I ask this? Did you think then that you did have COVID-19?
Yes, I did. I did.
Moving to September 2020, had your condition become worse?
Yes, indeed. It was much worse. At that time, I wasn't sleeping well at all. I was having vivid dreams. It was impossible to sleep because of the pain that I was feeling, specifically down my back. And I emailed the doctor about this, explained that the symptoms were getting worse. They said, possibly you've got a blood clot. So I was sent to hospital to have this checked out. But actually, it turned out to be a positive thing because I finally was validated because the doctor at the hospital himself had long COVID. And the symptoms I described, he said, you've got long COVID. So I felt completely validated at last that somebody understood what I was going through.
Can I ask, how were you able to have that conversation with that particular doctor?
Well, obviously, to begin with, we had masks on. I explained that I was deaf and relied on lip reading. So thankfully, the doctor removed the mask. And as you can imagine at the time, that was a risky thing to do. So I was able to lip read the doctor and explain what my symptoms were rather than having to write down. And also, the appointment took a lot longer because I was writing things down, lip reading, so the doctor was patient with me. And also, on the same day, I beg your pardon, at the time, we weren't allowed to have interpreters in the room, so I had no choice but to manage with the GP, the doctor, beg your pardon, through lip reading.
You said you felt validated.
Yes, I did. Yes, I did.
It had taken from March until September for you to receive that diagnosis.
Yes.
Can you help the inquiry understand how that delay had affected your mental health?
Oh, yes. Well, I'm actually a clinical psychologist, but this was a massive test for me in terms of my mental health because I felt so isolated. There was nobody that I could talk to who had the same symptoms as me. I was trying to Google, as you do, to find out what is going on with me. There was nobody to talk to. And people were looking at me saying, but Sarah, you look fine, but I wasn't. And I used the example of a car. So it's like the car looks fine on the outside. However, the dashboard is telling you there's all kinds of lights coming up saying there are problems. That's how I felt. And doctors, this particular doctor, it was wonderful in the end, because I'd been back and forth myself to my own GP, which took so much time. I was given medication that didn't work, that wasn't necessary, and I was so frustrated over the whole thing. So I eventually joined a group on Facebook for long COVID, and at last I felt I was in a community that understood my symptoms. I think that was around about the July time. I was determined to sort it out, and still my doctor wasn't taking on board the things that I was telling him until I'd gone with my lung to the hospital and got the diagnosis there. So that doctor had said to me, you need to check the antibodies, beg your pardon, through a blood test to see if you have had the COVID. And the numbers came back really high. So I was able to show my doctor this and say, oh, I knew I had the COVID. I absolutely knew I did. But anyway, in the March time, because my husband had tested positive in the March, I knew how bad it could be, but my doctor had never said, you know, you've got a positive COVID test. My life changed so much during that time, and that's the way it was. Mm-hmm.
Even after your long COVID diagnosis, did some medical professionals dismiss your concerns about your health?
Yes. I'll never forget one particular person. One doctor said, oh, long COVID isn't even a thing. And I said, well, why are blood donors not allowed to give, why are people with long COVID not allowed to give not allowed to give blood? Why are they not accepted to give blood? And also, why have the long COVID clinics been set up? And I felt like I was arguing with this medic, an NHS doctor, and I was having to convince him that long COVID was an actual thing.
Can I ask you about your experience of long COVID clinics? Can you describe the treatment you have received at those clinics?
So when I was diagnosed with long COVID, I was put on the waiting list for a long COVID clinic. 1 year later, eventually I got to meet and attend those clinics, 5 different clinics. My eyes, my eyes were really bad, and as a deaf person, that's critical because obviously I use my eyes to see everything and to communicate. They were awful from COVID. But very frustratingly, over the 5 clinics, they did book interpreters. I arrived at those clinics ready to go in, but unfortunately said an interpreter can't be present because the room was only big enough for 2 people. Obviously myself, the doctor, they hadn't considered the interpreter was attending also. So I've been waiting, for this appointment, waiting for this clinic, and an interpreter still wasn't able to attend. So they tried to find different rooms, obviously at full capacity at that time. They had so many things going on and they were full. So that meant the interpreter couldn't attend, and the appointments were cancelled, which made it more frustrating because obviously I'd waited so long. I thought the interpreter was sorted, but it still wasn't possible. So that wasn't a one-off. This happened repeatedly, and I felt that then my treatment was prolonged. And I wasn't getting the treatment that I thought I'd get from the start because of not being able to have interpreters present.
One of the things you say in your statement is that medical professionals had told you to exercise more. Can you tell the inquirer about the impact that exercising had on your symptoms?
I think one of the big reasons I had long COVID, because I carried on exercising. You know, I'm still, pissed off about that at the moment. At that time, I was absolutely wiped out. You know, I couldn't function, as I've explained. And the doctor said, okay, well, it's better that you exercise some more, just carry on. And as a psychologist, I know the benefits of exercise, absolutely. But that didn't work in this case. And I honestly believe that if I hadn't exercised, then these symptoms, I wouldn't have these symptoms today.
Can you help the inquiry understand how you've had to change your lifestyle as a result of long COVID?
Well, I mean, sugar, for one. I've had to cut out sugar because of my burnt tongue sensation. Sugar makes it worse. So certain foods I can't eat, obviously cakes and biscuits. I've had to reduce my carb intake. Caffeine, I can't tolerate caffeine anymore. It makes the pain worse in my body. I just have to drink water constantly. I can't function for 1 hour without water. I have to, because I have excessive dry mouth still. I can't remember when the pain actually, a day without pain actually. I have to have baths with Epsom salts. That every morning I have to have that. I have to help me to be able to function in the day. Things you take for granted, like cleaning the house, I can't do. I have to do one thing. So for example, cleaning the sink. Before I could clean the whole house in one go. Now I can barely clean this one sink. I really have to plan things in advance, and number one thing that helps me is pacing myself. I have to plan, if anything happens unexpectedly, then I'm going to be just going to ruin my routine and be wiped out. And if I'm doing something in the evening, if I'm doing something in the day, I can't go out in the evening also. Activities such as going out, on a Saturday or Sunday, I have to book the Monday off if I do Saturday and Sunday. That's my holiday that I'm having to take just to recover. It's rather than actually going on holiday, going for day trips, I'm booking that extra time for recovery. Walking is painful. I have to plan to make sure these are just short walks. Public transport is incredibly painful. Going on the tube, the stairs, absolutely awful. I'm having to take painkillers to manage that. I have a blue badge now. I never thought that I would need a blue badge now, but I have to. It does help me to reduce the walking to different places, reducing, how many stairs I have to do. But people look at me, even now, and I feel judged, actually saying, well, she looks absolutely fine. But, I might be looking like I function okay, but inside I'm absolutely not. It would be lovely to do things without having to think about them. I would absolutely love that, and to not have to pre-plan. I wish I could.
Can I move now to your husband's experience? I believe his COVID-19 symptoms started on the 23rd of March 2020, is that right?
Yes.
Can you tell us about the symptoms he experienced?
It makes me smile, actually, because his symptoms at that time, he lost his taste, but we didn't realise at that time. And he blamed my cooking. And he said, oh, gosh, your cooking tastes awful. And I was thinking, OK, well, maybe I've lost my sense of smell, so maybe that's affected my cooking. So I thought, OK. The next day, still, he was complaining about my cooking. And I thought, OK, do you know what? Maybe you need to go to Marks and Spencer's and buy your ready-made meals, OK? Still, he was saying it doesn't taste right. And this went on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. By the Thursday, he started to be very tired, very fatigued. And I was thinking, something's not right. So I decided for him, he booked Friday off, so he booked Friday off work. And we're both key workers, so we still working through lockdown. But he decided to book Friday off. So that was fun. And he took to his bed, so that was fine. I thought, well, I'm not really worried, you've gone to bed. By Saturday, he was sleeping non-stop. I had to really, nudge him to wake him up. I wanted him to have fluids. He's got kidney issues, so I thought it was really important that he keeps drinking. So I'd wake him up to drink fluids, but he kept falling fast back to sleep, and I thought, actually, something's not right. And at that time, I thought maybe there's an infection, maybe sepsis, because he's not going to the toilet, after these fluids. So I rang 111 through BSL, and of course had to wait a long time. That time everyone, a lot of waits. So they explained to me advice, and they thought, actually, we think it is an infection, but they're going to send for an ambulance. And because of COVID at that time, had to wait a long time for an ambulance. I think it was a few hours before the ambulance arrived. So then when the ambulance did arrive, they were in masks, all PPE, gloves, everything, and communication was incredibly difficult, having to write things down. So I had to ask my son to help with communication. As I said, my son is hearing, trying to explain the symptoms to the paramedics. So the paramedics said, actually, it is an infection, but we don't think it's sepsis. So it's best you call the doctor on Monday. Okay. So I thought, but I still thought, okay, something still doesn't feel right. And at that time, I thought possibly it could be COVID. I know he didn't have a temporal cough, but something felt like it. And I decided to stay in the room with him. And I slept on the floor that night. But, I wanted to be around for him. And I still felt, in my gut, something wasn't right. So I rung 111 again. And they said they're going to call me back. And I explained, well, we have a telephone system called Type Talk, which means, the hearing person can make the telephone call. And the operator types your message and gives it to me as the deaf person. I'll read what you've said and typed, and I'll type back, and we do it through that way. But you need to use a prefix as number one to use this service. And I knew NHS 111, their computer system would not accept that prefix. So they wouldn't be compatible. So I tried to explain this. I said, it wouldn't work. You won't be able to call me back. But they were adamant. They said, no, we'll call you back. And I said, OK, well, I've got my laptop ready, for this Type Talk. I'm ready, ready and waiting. About 1 o'clock in the morning, the phone was ringing, and I have my phone vibrating in my pocket. And they're talking to me. So I ran frantically to wake up my son. I mean, poor him. I had to ring him up, wake him up. And then it cut off. They stopped ringing. So I said, I'm sorry to my son, and went back to bed. Then again, the phone rang, and I'm running again to my son's room, waking him up, and again, they hung up. And it cut off. So it meant no phone calls could get through. About 5 o'clock in the morning, my husband, nudged me and sort of frantically nudged me and said, I'm having trouble breathing. I can't breathe. At that time, there was no 999 BSL, no 99 service, so you had to do an emergency text to 999 and I explained that my husband couldn't breathe. He was sweating profusely, an absolute panic. It was a terrible moment. And for half an hour, which is a long time in those sort of moments, an ambulance came with a doctor. Absolutely awful because, my husband couldn't breathe, and it was, he was having to really struggle with breathing. The communication was nowhere. I had to again wake up my son. So I woke up my son. Sorry, it's difficult because for the first time I had to use my son for communication. Adamant I don't want to use my children for my communication needs, but I could not communicate with the paramedics or the doctor. We couldn't write things down to explain what was happening. There was no time. This was an absolute emergency. It was, life or death. My husband couldn't breathe. So I had to use my son for communication. And I don't know what it was like for him. I can only imagine, to see his father in this state, the ambulance, the doctor. Anyway, thank you. Anyway.
Take a breath, Dr. Pam. Take a breath.
His oxygen level was really low, and they decided to take him to hospital. So they went to hospital. I stayed home. I had to stay home, and I was consoling my son, who, you know, just all happened so quickly.
During his stay at the hospital, how was your husband able to communicate with staff there?
Well, he didn't. Originally, he went along to A&E. He was taken to A&E. And he described it that the staff were in these suits, these hazmat suits, and they were completely covered, their faces with masks and what have you. And so he explained that he was deaf and used BSL. He wrote that down, and they said, well, you know, we can't get an interpreter. It's impossible because of the restrictions with the COVID. You're going to have to write with us. He was very poorly at the time. Now, normally, deaf people might use a video message to communicate with one another, but he wasn't well enough to do that. So it was very brief text between him and I. So I was at home, not really knowing what was going on in the hospital. And my husband must have been terrified because he was alone. He didn't have me with him. And everybody had masks on, or the has suits. He was having difficulties breathing. He was using oxygen, and they were monitoring all of his levels. The hospital wrote to him that it may be COVID-19, coronavirus, and they said they'd have to test him. But I can't imagine that. He told me about the staff coming with a hazmat suit on and a box with, you know, the skull and crossbones symbol on the box. And that's what my husband saw. And he didn't know what was in the box. He knows now. But at the time, it was all new to him, and he wondered, well, what is in this box? What are they, you know, what are they planning? 2 days later, he did test positive for the coronavirus and was put on a ward for that reason.
I think on his third or fourth day, you received a message from him asking you to translate a note a doctor had written to him. Can you tell us what that note said?
The note said that he was getting worse and wasn't responding to treatment, and that he would have to be ventilated. And so the doctor was asking for consent from my husband. There was no communication from the hospital, appropriate communication. And I didn't realise it was that bad until I saw the note that my husband asked me to translate. I couldn't translate it into BSL because normally, if my husband's not understood something, I would do a quick video and sign to him what a written information might say. But because I was so upset by the content of the note, I couldn't describe it in BSL. So I had to do a very plain English translation and said to him, speak to the doctor and ask them about your treatment. Just said that you're going to need different treatment that may help. They may need to put you asleep to help you breathe. But I wanted to say more than that, but I was terrified for him because he was so isolated in a hospital. He was so alone with no communication and no support, no interpreter provision.
Was ventilation necessary in the end?
No, thank God. They were preparing to move my husband across. They wanted to do one more test before, and his oxygen levels started to go up. So they said, let's just wait and see. And eventually they decided they didn't need to ventilate. Yeah.
A few days later, I think, you received a message from him to say that he could come home.
Yes. Yeah, it was strange, really, because I'd had no contact from the hospital, I'd had to, and I felt, I wonder if I was hearing, if I wasn't deaf, would there be more contact? Because it seemed that hearing family members were getting information about their loved ones, and they weren't prepared to communicate with me. And all the information that I got about his healthcare and what was happening in the hospital was coming from my husband, not from the hospital staff. Can you imagine that? He was so ill, so poorly, and he had to take control. He'd send me photographs of the drips and the equipment that they were using, his oxygen, with a few words. Anyway, he texted me to say he was coming home, which I thought was odd. And they'd written him a note, so he took a photograph of the note that the staff had written for him. And they said his symptoms were stabilising and he was okay to go home to recover, which of course I was delighted about. But at the same time, I thought, is he really ready to come home? Because he'd been so ill. And how are we going to cope at home? Anyway, I realised that they were short of beds and, you know, they needed to get other people in. But I know that now, but at the time I didn't realise that. When I went to pick him up, I was sat outside the hospital in my car waiting for him. Now, they were waiting for the staff were waiting for the corridor to be clear before they could bring my husband out. He was in a wheelchair. And so for me, I thought he's still ill. So I got him into the car and my husband burst out crying. He burst out crying because of the awful experience he'd had in hospital, and he was so happy to be with me, to be able to communicate on a one-to-one with me.
How would you describe your husband's symptoms when you collected him and then over the next few days?
Well, he'd lost weight because he's a big man, and it was so obvious that he'd lost weight. He was weak and tired, so fatigued. We went home and he went straight to bed. I kept checking, are you okay? And he said, oh, I'm just worn out. He couldn't really walk. He couldn't manage the stairs very well, so stayed upstairs in the bedroom. And then he started to get some chest pain. So I was ever so worried about that. Contacted 111 again through the BSL system, explained what had happened, got a call back. They said, beg your pardon, we'll call you back. And I said, no, that system doesn't work. We're not doing that this time. And they said, well, you know, I insisted that he was seen by someone at this point. And eventually they said, go to the COVID centre. I wasn't allowed to go with him. But I didn't want him to have the same experience again with the communication breakdown. And so I contacted a team of interpreters that I work with regularly through my employment, and managed to find one and said, will you be able to work with my husband online whilst he goes to this appointment, which we paid for from our pockets because the experience had been so bad and we wanted to avoid that. So we went along to the COVID centre and the interpreter was working with him remotely and it went really well. My husband felt so much better. He was able to describe what was going on. They diagnosed an infection. He was given antibiotics and came home. So it works so much better having that communication on a one-to-one. And I was so anxious that I didn't want him to go through that experience again that he'd had through the hospital. And as I've said, interpreters weren't allowed to be there face-to-face, hence the online.
Can you describe the long-term impact that COVID-19 has had on your husband?
Well, I mean, we both have different symptoms. His main symptom is fatigue, very fatigued. His loss of taste, still has loss of taste, has pain, joint pain. His memory is very, he forgets easily. So it's hard for both of us to sort of adapt to that because he has loss of memory and sort of difficult to remember things. So I'm very patient. I try to be very patient. Obviously, that doesn't always work. But, we try to have different, plans and systems in place, having sort of things visual to help remember. He was diagnosed with a blood clot, an unprovoked blood clot. But we knew it was linked to COVID-19. And recently, he had an infection in his body. He couldn't cope, so he had to stay in hospital for a number of days for that infection. His immune system was so low, that's similar to me. He's had terrible, trauma experience from what's happened. He still can't talk about really what's happened, and he struggles. And he has that trauma from that experience in hospital still.
Finally, Dr. Powell, can I ask you this? What could have been done to improve both of your experiences of the healthcare system during the pandemic?
I mean, 4 years later, my husband went to hospital actually recently, stayed for 6 days, and there was still no interpreter. So things haven't changed from then until now. So that's a clear example of that. I wish, there'd be automatically flag up on the medical system to say this patient is deaf, they use BSL. There's a system of accessible information standards, but still it's not widely known. I wish it would automatically flag up to show that I'm a deaf BSL user. I wish their computer system would allow the prefix to use to make that phone call, because not all deaf people can, whilst they use BSL, they can't use Type Talk. It's very primitive that the access at the moment still. They should be able to have to be able to access that communication. They should be able to have the interpreter the same day of admission, either face-to-face or use a remote device, anything, that they can have that BSL, and they're able to articulate how they want through their chosen language, which is BSL, using an interpreter, rather than us having to write, scrappy pieces of notes, English. How do you articulate that? These very complex, things that are going on in hospital. So this access absolutely needs to improve. And I feel, mine and my husband's symptoms, they've been prolonged because of these barriers in communication and access. But also, I wish the doctors would accept more about long COVID is a thing, rather than having to prove myself, showing different things to show that I have long COVID, to have this explanation. I wish that they got it from straight away from the symptoms. And, the impact that that's had, I accept that it's still not much known in terms of the treatment for long COVID. I do understand that. But what I want is that acceptance that long COVID is a thing, and that's really important for me. It was such an awful experience to be dismissed by medical professionals, to experience those barriers, arriving to appointment, saying the appointment room isn't big enough, not considering the interpreter, come on. I've got an appointment finally for rheumatology, but they're saying it's a telephone appointment. Why did they not read the notes to say I'm deaf? So even now they're offering me a telephone appointment. That appointment now has had to be cancelled, so I'll have to wait some more until they can find me a face-to-face appointment. So it's still ongoing. We're still facing these barriers.
Dr. Powell, thank you. My lady, that's all I ask.
Thank you very much indeed for your help, Dr. Powell. I'm very grateful. I just hope that the symptoms that you and your husband are suffering do ease in the foreseeable future. I appreciate how difficult it must have been, and I've become very conscious since I started chairing this inquiry of how acceptance of long COVID is so important to sufferers like you. I also hope that you've forgiven your husband for his monstrous remark about your cooking.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you very much to our excellent interpreters.
Thank you, my lady.
My lady, may I please call Caroline Abrahams?
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
I hope we haven't kept you waiting too long.
No, that's fine, thank you.
Your full name, please.
Caroline Susan Abrahams.
Ms Abrahams, you are the Charity Director of Age UK.
I am.
You have provided a statement to the inquiry. The reference for that is INQ 000 319639. Can you begin by describing, in broad terms, the work of Age UK?
Age UK is a national charity for older people. We have 130 component parts. We have 120 local Age UKs, which offer services and support to older people in their local communities. We also have Age Scotland, Age Wales, Age Northern Ireland, and there's a national charity that provides information and advice, and that also lobbies and campaigns on behalf of older people, and a sister charity called Age International that supports older people in low and middle income countries.
First topic, please, the heightened risk that COVID-19 posed to older people. At paragraph 10 of your statement, you identify that age is the single biggest risk factor for experiencing severe illness and dying from COVID-19.
Correct.
In doing so, you refer to a study by the Intensive Care National Audit and Research Centre. I wonder whether you could tell us what that study found.
Yes, certainly. It found what you've just said, which is the older you are, the more likely it is that if you do contract COVID-19, you will suffer serious illness or death. And it goes up very steeply with age.
I wonder if we could go on screen, please, to INQ 00022 1437. This is an extract from a paper by the Office for National Statistics about COVID-19 deaths which occurred in April 2020. Can you help us, please, Ms Abrahams, with what this graph illustrates?
Sure. So if you look at the green on the far left, those are the people who have died from COVID-19 aged under 65. And then everybody else, all those other colours, are the people over age 65 who died from COVID-19. So you can see just how much bigger your risk is if you were not a working age.
So those are the figures. Can we consider the reasons behind them? Why is it, please, that age is such a risk factor?
I think it's important to realise there's nothing magical about your numerical age. It isn't that you reach a certain number of years and then immediately you are bound to have a certain outcome. It's much more complicated than that. It's partly and probably mainly due to the fact that as we get older, we're more likely to get certain long-term health conditions that undermine our health and our resilience. So if something like a virus like Covid-19 comes along, we find it harder to fight it off. People are perfectly able to live with those long-term conditions, but they do make you more vulnerable. And in turn, those conditions, whether you have them or not, partly due to luck, partly genetics, but also, very importantly, your social and economic status.
At your paragraph 17, you comment precisely on that. You list 4 reasons why older people in the least advantaged circumstances faced both a higher risk of exposure and increased barriers to accessing services. I wonder whether you could take the inquiry through those reasons, please.
Yes. People from lower socio-economic groups are more likely to have long-term conditions, to acquire them earlier on in life, to have them more severe. And at the same time, they face problems in accessing healthcare for a variety of reasons, and their overall circumstances living at home may be more difficult. They may not be able to afford to keep their homes warm. They may not be able to afford special diets or to eat and drink well enough to sustain their health as well as it might be and their resilience. So they face a cluster of problems which made them much more likely to be at risk during the pandemic.
Can we also next think about how an older person's race increased their risk? Please can we go to INQ 000 217401. This is Age UK's consultation response to the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities, which was published in November 2020.
Yep.
If we move to page 2, last paragraph of the introduction, 3 lines down, we read, the latest ONS data shows that all ethnic minority groups, except the Chinese community, have higher rates of death involving COVID-19, with Black Caribbean men aged 65 plus having the highest rates of death at almost 2.3 times higher than white men of the same age. Are you able first to say when evidence of this disparity started to come to your attention during 2020?
I can't honestly remember when that first became apparent. There was a lot of public conversation during the pandemic about the heightened risks to people from minoritised communities. Very rarely was it said that they were almost all older people. So the debates happened separately, which was bizarre because really we were talking about almost always older people, but from minoritised communities. And of course, not from all minoritised communities, as the highlighted section shows. Communities where there was more affluence were more protected. So, but certainly what we know more generally about the lives and experiences of older people across the board would have led us to believe anyway that people from minoritised communities would be impeded by structural racism, as we say indeed in our consultation response.
You said the debates happened separately. In your view, why did that happen?
I think because of ageism, actually. And of course, that was one of the big problems for the people we're talking about here. They not only faced problems of discrimination due to their age, but also because of their race. And that was mirrored in the public debate.
Please, can we next go to INQ 000 176650, page 20. This is a page from a study published by Age UK based on surveys conducted in August and September 2020. What do we learn here about the reasons for the higher incidence and severity of COVID-19 in older BAME people?
Yes. One factor definitely is people are more likely from these communities to be living together with younger members of the family or to be interacting more with younger members of the family, making it more likely that they would acquire the virus in the first place. Might also be living in homes that were not decent in the technical sense of not being warm, and also other health risks that these people were very often living with, underlying conditions including obesity, diabetes and heart disease, all of which lowered their resilience, made it harder to overcome the virus if they were to acquire it.
Next, please, can we consider the unequal impact that the digitisation of healthcare services had on older people? Please can we go to INQ 000217-404. This graph comes from a briefing paper published by Age UK in December 2021 called Living in a Digital World After COVID-19. To orient ourselves, we see the proportion of recent internet users by age since 2011. Blue line representing those between 65 to 74, red line 75 and over. What do we learn here both about the internet use of these age groups going into the pandemic and during?
Yes, well, the first thing that this graph tells us is that the older you are, the less likely you are to be online. So there's quite a big gap, isn't there, between the 75 and over line and the 65 to 74 line. And in both cases, the trend is upwards. More older people are going online over time, but there still remain a significant proportion who are not online. And there are other reasons for us to feel at Age UK that actually these statistics overstate the digital competence of the older population, because we know it's not just about whether you are online or not. It's whether you have the skills and the confidence to be able to do quite sophisticated things as were required during the pandemic. In fact, about half of the over 65 population, we think, either isn't online at all or is not able to go online successfully and safely.
If we move, please to page 4 of that document, and it's the third paragraph, last sentence. For example, in early 2020, just 53% of people aged 65 plus in Great Britain used a smartphone for private use. Does that also tell us something about those internet use figures?
It does, indeed. Having a smartphone or some way of being able to interact digitally is absolutely key. And we also know of quite a few older people who have maybe been given one by a son or daughter for Christmas, but it sits in a drawer rather than being actively used. And, you know, I don't want to overstate it. Some older people are very competent and avid users of the internet, but very many aren't.
Can I just ask a question? You said many older people are not able to do things that are considered more sophisticated. I was thinking there's something that most younger people wouldn't think was sophisticated, which is just doing a Zoom call, doing a remote call.
Yes.
And a number of people I know who are older are basically terrified. They've no idea how to do a remote call, and that's something that younger people wouldn't think was sophisticated at all.
it makes such a difference if you've grown up with the technology. And of course, by definition, this age group hasn't and have been late acquirers. And if you didn't have to use it at work for whatever reason, then you can reach 60, 70 now and have had very little contact with it.
Relatedly, what challenges did those telephone and video consultations pose for older people during the pandemic?
Absolutely enormous challenges, and frankly continuing challenges today, because what happened was that although there was a trend, a policy trend within the NHS of starting to use interactive technology, it got a huge boost in terms of acceleration because of the circumstances of the pandemic. And what this meant was that some older people found that overnight, the way of getting hold of your GP, for example, changed from being able to walk to your surgery and have a conversation with someone behind a desk to having to navigate that process online or possibly over the phone using telephone prompts. And so that was very, very destabilising for some older people.
At paragraph 26 of your statement, you say this: people struggle to understand how to reach their GP if not in person, not helped by the fact that most signposting information and advice was available online.
Yes.
Overlooking the fact that large numbers of older people are not digitally enabled.
Yes. The system forgot about older people not being online. And of course, GP practices and their staff, in many cases, were trying this out for the first time and frankly didn't always get it right.
In some cases, are you aware anecdotally of older people being asked to perform tests or checks on themselves during a remote consultation?
Certainly, and then of being asked to do things like take a photo of that wound you're worried about on your leg and upload it to our website or attach it to an email and send it to us. And that requires a degree of sophistication that is likely to be beyond somebody, for example, who only uses the internet to go on Facebook or to play Sudoku, which is not unusual amongst older people.
At your paragraph 29, you say there was an increase in expectation for patients to do basic checks, such as blood pressure and pulse readings. Did you receive reports that older people lacked confidence in performing those checks?
Yes, because these were things that throughout their lives they had gone to a GP, sat in front of a nurse, and they'd done it for them. So this was something new and different, which they weren't being particularly well supported to do for themselves.
My lady, I'm about to move on to a new topic.
Certainly. As you'll remember, Ms. Abrams, the last time you helped me, we take a regular break for the sake of the stenographers. So I shall return 5 to 12. All rise.
Ms. Abrahams, next topic, please. Suspension of routine care. At paragraph 12 of your statement, you say this: the older population are far more reliant on routine health services. Can you help us understand the impact of the suspension of these services on older people during the pandemic?
So we've already talked about the fact that as people get older, they're more likely to have a number of long-term health conditions. In the past, these are things that might have killed us, but now, thanks to medical advance, we're able to help people to live with them. Things like many cancers, diabetes, kidney disease. But people do need to be monitored. Their treatment needs to be updated sometimes. And so you'll often find older people in that situation with 1 or 2 appointments every week or so, having to go to hospital or for tests of various kinds or to clinics. And during the pandemic, a lot of that stopped. And so people with these health conditions very often found they got worse. There wasn't the ongoing supervision. One of the points of these clinics is to pick up when something's getting worse early on, so you can intervene quickly, but that opportunity was often lost as well.
Was one result of that patients presented later on with a more advanced form of the illness they had been suffering from?
Absolutely, unfortunately so.
At your paragraph 40, you explain that access to routine medication was made more difficult for older people. Can you describe to us what the barriers to access were?
Firstly, if people were having problems contacting their GP, they couldn't ask for repeat prescriptions or new prescriptions. That was the first barrier. But then, even once the request had been accepted, some older people were too frightened to go out or to visit a chemist to pick it up because of fear of contracting the virus. There were also medication shortages during the pandemic, which was another barrier for people being able to get what they needed quickly.
Please can we go to INQ 000 217383. What does this graph illustrate about the relationship between age and the number of medications a person is likely to need?
So as we get older, not only are we more likely to have multiple long-term conditions, it follows we're more likely to be given medication of various kinds to deal with those things. And you can see it's a very clear, straight upward curve as we get older.
Does it follow then that the consequences of the barriers to accessing medication would have been more severe the older a person was?
Absolutely, and we have to remember that some of the conditions that people are living with in these older age groups are ones that can kill you if they're not properly controlled.
Next, please, can we consider the approach of older people to engaging with the healthcare system during the pandemic? Please can we go to INQ 000 176650, page 10. This comes from the Age UK report we have already looked at. I'd like to consider the quotation in the top left. This comes from a man between 70 and 74. Due to the stress and anxiety I have experienced severe headaches and migraine-type attacks of flashing light in the eyes. Now this, also frightened to go to hospital when offered, when I felt extremely anxious on one occasion. In your answer a moment ago, you alluded to older people being frightened to go out to a pharmacy. Does what this man says here about going to hospital reflect a fear that was common amongst older people during the pandemic?
Yes, we certainly heard this a lot from older people who were watching the news, listening to the news conferences, and I think often associating hospitals not as places of healing in some cases, but of places where people were dying, and certainly a fear that the virus would be found there and that they would be at an enhanced risk of contracting it should they attend. But that wasn't the only factor. The other factor putting people off was, I think, some of the messaging, which was about protecting the NHS and not going to hospital unless you really needed to. And we know at Age UK that when older people hear messages like that, even when they're not really directed towards them, they often do react in ways that are very responsible socially, so they would be less inclined to go.
At your 65, you refer to a fear of overburdening
Yes,
the NHS.
exactly that.
Do we imagine a pervasive sense of guilt about going to hospital?
In some cases, yes, and of course we have to remember the wider context to that at the time, which was lots of conversation in the media and elsewhere about really this being a problem about older people, not about the whole population. So I think older people did feel stigmatised by some of that, and it would have made them more worried about burdening very important public services.
Can I ask, in your view, in respect of older people, did public messaging strike the right balance between, on the one hand, protecting the NHS and, on the other, making sure older people sought healthcare when they required it?
I think the problem is, as I've just tried to describe, that the blanket message about protect the NHS, stay away unless you absolutely have to go, wasn't ever really designed to be heard by older people, but that is exactly the group that reacted to it probably most strongly. So that had an unintended consequence of putting older people off when they really should have gone to hospital, and doctors and nurses wanted them to go to hospital.
As well as the public messaging and the impact of that, anecdotally, were you made aware of instances of older people being discouraged or prevented from accessing healthcare services?
Yes, absolutely. And that was the other side of the coin, that there were a number of policy initiatives and more ad hoc things that we heard about from local areas where it was made very clear to older people that they should not go to hospital, that an ambulance wouldn't take them and they wouldn't be received into hospital were they to go, regardless, actually, of the condition with which they were presenting.
Can we move now to consider older people's access to critical care?
Before you do that, Ms. Mills, sorry to interrupt. The policy initiatives you're talking about there, about ambulance not taking them, they shouldn't go to a hospital. Can you give me an example of what you mean?
Yes, this is what's referred to, I think, in the statement as non-conveyance, where there were discussions with NHS England and others about what the guidance should be to ambulances and to the public about who was to be taken to hospital and who wasn't, particularly around, for example, older people living in care homes, and whether they would actually ever be given an ambulance to go to hospital or would be expected to stay in the care home and be dealt with and cared for by the staff, which sounds okay, except unfortunately care staff are not medically trained, and for periods during the pandemic it was very difficult for many care homes to get the clinical support they needed.
Mr. Mills.
Please can we have on screen INQ 000 408832. This is an iteration of the Covid-19 decision support tool to manage access to critical care as developed by the Department of Health and Social Care's Moral and Ethical Advisory Group. At paragraph 56 of your statement, you say this: in a system with significant pre-existing evidence of age discrimination, there were huge and unacceptable risks that this tool would be misused to deny acute care to older people. Can you set out, please, the 4 major concerns that Age UK had with this tool?
Yes. First and foremost, because this was produced and was being discussed very near the beginning of the pandemic in March 2020, when we still didn't know very much about the disease. The data and the evidence about it was still very much emerging. Secondly, because the policy implicitly relied on the idea that you could correctly and easily assess somebody's frailty status and their relevant long-term conditions. And we know that's very hard to do at the best of times, let alone during a pandemic when everybody is in a great rush. Thirdly, because we were worried about the ability of the NHS to implement this policy fairly and consistently. And lastly, because we thought that if knowledge of this tool was to be shared or to escape to the public, that it would cause enormous panic amongst our older population and undermine trust in the NHS at exactly the time when we needed to sustain it. And this was the single most difficult thing that we dealt with as Age UK during the pandemic, and the thing that gave us the greatest concern. Because, just to be clear, what this shows is that somebody who was aged 80 and who is in good health would automatically not get help from intensive care should they need it. And the problem is that the age impacts us very differently. And so, of course, there might be an older person who's 80 who was very unwell, who was reaching the end of their life. But equally, we could have someone who's just run the marathon. And this blanket policy, at a time of enormous public disquiet, great turmoil within the NHS, could far too easily have resulted in people being denied care simply on the basis of their age. And we considered this to be totally unacceptable, to the extent that when I had the opportunity to talk to somebody from the committee about it, I said that unless they stopped it, we would leak it to the media and we would kill it, because that's how strongly I personally felt about this.
What was the outcome of the interaction you had with the group?
In the event, fortunately, thankfully, conditions within our hospitals improved just in time to mean that there was never a need formally to put anything like this into practice. Although, unfortunately, we do know that something like this was used in some local areas at times, which was very sad. I suspect the fact that I said what I said may have made a small difference, but I think really ultimately, thankfully, the position in our hospitals improved, and that was the key factor.
Thank you. That can come down. Next, please, long COVID. At paragraph 79 of your statement, you raised the concern that long COVID symptoms in older people are at risk of being written off as age-related. Are you able to provide some examples of the types of symptom that are at risk of being written off?
Yes. I think a very obvious one is delirium, which is often anyway mistaken in hospitals for dementia. And it's a reaction to stress and uncertainty and different sorts of living conditions which older people quite often can display when they're taken into hospital because it's new and foreign and they're not very well. And it seemed all too easy, and from what we've heard from older people, for those who may have long COVID simply to be told, oh, it's just your age. And there isn't enough research at the moment specifically looking at how long COVID impacts different age groups, particularly older people who do, as I say, respond differently sometimes to illness.
Finally, can we turn to the lessons of the pandemic? Your statement concludes with this observation: the pandemic has highlighted and exacerbated pre-existing discrimination towards older people. What are the key recommendations you would like this inquiry to consider to ensure that this does not happen again in a future pandemic?
So I'll pick out three. The first, and probably the most important, that there needs to be a much stronger rights-based framework embedded in how our health system works to challenge and root out the very obvious age discrimination that exists and that became very apparent during the pandemic, with that decision support tool being the most flagrant example, but not the only example. Secondly, getting it right in the community and with primary care, with GPs, with community services, making those strong enough to be able to still provide good care even under the most stressful conditions is very, very important. And finally, because unfortunately tackling the ageism within the NHS will be a marathon, not a sprint, the importance of the NHS and government working more constructively with the VCSE and with social care during an emergency like this. Because had that happened, we would have been we saw some of this coming, and we could have alerted politicians and policymakers in time for them to change some of their decisions in a way that I think ultimately would have saved lives.
Ms Abrahams, thank you, my lady. That's all I ask.
I think we have some questions for you, Ms Abrahams. I think we start with Ms Mitchell. Who's that away?
I'm obliged, my lady. Miss Abrams, I appear as instructed by Amar Anwar and Company on behalf of the Scottish COVID bereaved. Hearing what you have said about advice you just tendered there, I'm going to ask you the same to see if there are some recommendations that might assist. It's the experience of the Scottish COVID bereaved that older family members were asked to sign DNA CPRs. And even when they didn't sign it, they were worried that this would impact upon the medical treatment they would receive. First of all, was that something noticed by you in any feedback that you got?
Yes, it certainly was, I'm afraid.
And secondly, given that is so, in what way can the trust be rebuilt between healthcare, government and people of age to give older people the confidence to ask for their healthcare needs to be met when the next pandemic comes?
Yes, well, again, that is going to take time and hard work. And there's nothing wrong with advanced care planning, but it needs to be advanced. It can't be done in a rush, in an emergency, and if that happens, we can't expect the outcomes to be good. So I think the answer is to take advanced care planning more seriously right across our society and not just see it as something to be used in extremis.
And do you think that would have the effect of allowing people a confidence in their own autonomy over their health or the right to demand healthcare where it's required?
Yes, as long as it is done properly and well, and ideally well in advance of any of us ever needing to face these decisions in reality. People of my age should be doing this now.
My next question is also in relation perhaps to some assistance you might be able to give. Some of those that I represent in the Scottish COVID bereaved have experience of family members, particularly older family members, having been isolated and unfortunately thereafter becoming ill with COVID and dying. You, in your statement, talk about isolation for older people sometimes and the issue of loneliness. How important do you think it is for consideration to be given to tackling, or at least not exacerbating, loneliness when promulgating policies during a pandemic?
I think it's tremendously important, and it was the need for older people in particular, especially if they were living alone, or if they were in a care home, of course, in a residential setting or a hospital, to have people they know and love and trust around them wasn't properly understood. But we can certainly see it now, because I think many older people emerged from the pandemic with significant mental health problems created by the isolation that they experienced at that time.
And I think we saw in the document that my learned friend brought up earlier about the feelings of anxiety that many older people are feeling. Again, the same question that I asked before in relation to the other matter. Given that there is that anxiety, is there anything that could be put in place to try and ensure that people can gain confidence that their health care will be met in the next pandemic?
It's a big ask, isn't it? But I am reassured that these messages about taking older people's health needs seriously are being listened to, at least in England. I cannot say whether it is the same in Scotland, but policy developments underway now from our new government should help us get to a place where older people's needs are better met at home and in the community, but it's going to take time.
I'm obliged. Our questions are due in today for our Healthcare Minister, so that may be a timely opportunity for us to pose that question. I'm obliged, my lady.
Thank you, Mr. Bishop. Just pursuing that, one of the reasons, obviously, people felt isolated was they're in their own homes, they don't have family nearby, and any family that can visit, they're stuck outside. It's trying to look after people like that depended a lot on local communities and people who were prepared to go and collect the medication, deliver supplies. Are you confident that enough work is going on involving the voluntary and community sector in making sure that if anything like this does happen again, that there are people who can step in to try and relieve some of the loneliness and isolation?
I think you're absolutely right. We certainly saw during the pandemic that people stepped up. There was amazing examples of formal organisations, but informal groups too, getting together to support older people in particular, who really benefited from it. But that's all gone. And unfortunately, not only is the same impetus not there now, we're also seeing voluntary organisations in local areas closing because they can't afford to keep running. So taking support, taking infrastructure seriously in the community and building it up would definitely put us in a better place should we face another pandemic.
Thank you. Mr. Witherby, I think you're next.
Microphone's working, thank you. Good afternoon, Ms Abrahams. I ask questions on behalf of COVID Bereaved Families for Justice UK. Just one very short topic, but it's an important topic, and you've touched upon it already. In your statement, for the record, it's paragraph 62 to 63. You refer to evidence that Age UK had, I think, early in the pandemic, but ongoing, evidence relating to the blanket use of DNA CPRs and denial of care policies relating to age. And earlier in your statement, you'd referred to the fact that Age UK was a major charity, had a major qualitative and quantitative research programme and collected insights from literally hundreds of thousands of older people. So when you refer to evidence in your statement, it's widespread evidence. Is that fair?
Yes, and I think, as with so much during the pandemic, it was patchy. So there were some areas and some places where we know that these practices happened. They were relatively isolated, but within a very broad national context.
Yes.
There wasn't a simple pattern.
No. And that caused you, I think, to pressure NHS England initially to take steps, and they did take steps to indicate to stakeholders that policies such as these were unacceptable. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. But however, you do go on then to say that in fact that you then had evidence of the practices continuing, and you subsequently issued a series of public statements between March and November 2020 relating to these issues to highlight them. Is that right?
Correct.
Now, the statements were co-signed by your partners from and other partners from Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. And does that reflect the fact that the concerns were widespread not just within England, but in fact across the UK?
Absolutely.
And finally, this, in respect of those statements, that series of statements over those months, to what extent, so far as you're able to say from the evidence that you're able to collect, To what extent did those statements have an effect?
Very hard to say, I'm
Yeah.
afraid. But I think the fact that the organisations and individuals who included appointed commissioners for older people in Northern Ireland and Wales came together to express such strong concern,
Yes.
I think was heard
Yes.
where it needed to be heard.
Thank you very much. That's all I asked.
Thank you very much, Mr. Weatherby. Mr. Wolfe. Oh, there you are. I don't know if you've got a line of sight to Mr.
Yes,
Wolfe.
I have, thank you.
Good, thank you.
Across the pillar. Thank you very much. Morning, Ms Abrams. I asked questions on behalf of the Patients Association, Care Rights UK and John's campaign. I've just got three brief topics, if I may, arising from your evidence. The first one relates to barriers to older people accessing information during the pandemic. You mentioned in paragraphs 17 and 27 of your witness statement barriers around technology, you've talked about that this morning, and also barriers around English as a not a first language. Would those things have been improved, access to information, if family carers had had more involvement in the delivery of healthcare?
Yes.
And how might that be changed in the future?
Well, I think there was a long debate, a very intense debate throughout the pandemic about the extent to which family carers were equal partners in the care of their older relatives, together with the NHS and social care. I think many people assumed at the start they were equal partners, but some of the events that happened, the policies that came into place, caused that to be questioned. So taking forward those principles, I think they'll probably be discussed in a future module, obviously, in particular of this inquiry, would make a difference. But of course, we also have to remember that a lot of older people don't have family carers and are completely on their own, have nobody to advocate for them. And in the end, it's those older people who we at Age UK worried about the most through the pandemic, and they probably had the worst outcomes of all.
Thank you. Second topic, if I may, access to healthcare for people with dementia. Paragraph 38 of your witness statement, you explain that dementia patients experienced a rapid deterioration in cognitive functions. Some were left alone without visitors and with no understanding of what was going on around them, with no family access. Do you think sufficient consideration was given to the needs of people with dementia during the pandemic whilst in hospital?
No.
And might that have been affected again by the involvement of family members and family carers?
Yes.
And again, how might that change in the future?
I hope that new laws and regulations will come into place to make it clear that if somebody with dementia is in hospital or is in a care home, that their family carers, under certain conditions, should always have the right to be with them. That would have made an enormous difference to the well-being and the survival, I think, of some older people during the pandemic.
Third topic, if I may, your organisation gave evidence to the Joint Committee on Human Rights. One of the topics it talked about was the need for individualised assessments and an individualised approach. Again, how do you think that played out in the pandemic? Was there a sufficiently individualised approach?
Absolutely not. All the things I have talked about today, our biggest concerns for older people during the pandemic were when blanket policies were imposed or when sweeping assumptions were made about older people all being the same. And older people are not all the same. And we need to improve the sophistication of our analysis of how our systems work to take that fully into account.
Finally, if I may, one aspect of those individualised assessments, reasonable adjustments under the Equality Act. Again, any observations on how reasonable adjustments, including possibly, again, involvement of family carers as a reasonable adjustment, took place during the pandemic?
Well, as far as we're aware, they didn't, or not very much. And more generally, the fact that age is a protected characteristic under the Equality Act is often overlooked. Disability is talked about much more often. And that's nothing wrong with that, of course. But enormous numbers of our professionals and people who interact with older people are totally unaware that the Equality Act applies to older people too.
I get the impression that almost you would say the Equality Act was suspended during the pandemic. Would that be a fair assessment?
That assumes it was ever applied properly to older people in the first place, which our view is it isn't.
Thank you, Ms Abrams. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Orr. I think that completes the questions we had for you, Ms Abrams. I think I might have said it when you first helped me in the module 2, I think it was, wasn't it? I'm really grateful to you for your help. You are an excellent communicator and a superb witness, and everything you've done so far, and I'm afraid it is so far because I fear we may be calling on your help again in a future module, has been extremely helpful. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Please call Jackie O'Sullivan.
Thank you, Mr. Fung.
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Mr. Sullivan, I hope you're warned there might be a delay before we called you,
Yes.
or we may have got to you earlier than you expected. I don't know.
Yes, I was. Thank you.
Mr. Sullivan, you are the Chief Executive of the Royal MENCAP Society, is that correct?
No, I was the acting chief executive, but I'm actually the director of strategy and influence.
I apologise.
That's okay.
Thank you for that correction. Can you, though, please tell us a little bit about MENCAP, its role generally and its role during the pandemic?
Yes, of course. So we are a learning disability charity. We support around 4,000 people in social care settings. We have a further 2,000 that we support through employment programmes and various other community activities. We have a network of over 300 independent organisations, and through them we have contact with 40,000 people with a learning disability. We also run an information and advice service and deal with 12,000 calls to our helpline every year and around 40,000 visits to our website every month. And we campaign, particularly on health, on employment, and getting people out of assessment and treatment units.
Is it right that MENCAP's remit is in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, but not in Scotland?
That's right, that's correct.
I want to ask you today about some of the concerns that MENCAP had, predominantly during the relevant period of Module 3. If we can start, please, with the disproportionate number of deaths amongst people with learning disabilities. Your witness statement sets out that pre-pandemic,
yes,
NHS England's 2019 Learning Disability Mortality Review demonstrated that women with a learning disability died 27 years earlier than the general population and men 22 years earlier than those in the general population. Do you recognise those figures, first of all?
Yes, absolutely. And we knew going into the pandemic that it was likely that these health inequalities would be exacerbated, and I'm afraid that was the case.
The inquiry heard a couple of weeks ago
yes.
From Mr. Matthew Stringer on behalf of the Disability Charities Consortium. And he gave evidence that during the pandemic, people with a learning disability were 6 times more likely to die than those without learning disabilities, and that this was 30 times more likely for adults between 18 and 34.
Yes.
Again, are you familiar with those figures?
Yes, I am. And that's backed up as well. So we had some data from CQC in June 2020, which showed a 134% increase in the number of deaths of people with a learning disability. And the age group that was particularly affected was 55 to 64, so people were dying at a younger age. And obviously then we had the PHE data, which you referred to just now, and then the Office of National Statistics that showed that disabled people were 60% of the deaths due to COVID were from disabled people. So we suspected that people would be severely impacted, and then we heard about this anecdotally. The way we were set up was because we have so much direct contact with people in our day-to-day lives. We were picking up on early signs. We were getting calls to the helpline. A lot of the organisation was focused on supporting the people we have direct responsibility for through this. But my role particularly was thinking, how are we going to show up for the wider 1.5 million people with a learning disability in the UK? And what do we need to do? So we were picking up on news reports, on government announcements, on people calling the helpline, on things that we were hearing through our services and through our network partners, and just trying to do our best to support people through the pandemic, because we knew that people were likely to die in greater numbers. And then the evidence started to unfold, and sure enough, that was the case.
You've mentioned your suspicion that that may have been the case early on during the pandemic. What do you consider to be the main reasons, both that you had that suspicion and indeed that in fact it became a reality? What do you consider to be the main reasons for the disproportionate number of deaths amongst people with learning disabilities?
So in some ways they weren't thought about, they weren't considered, and we see that in general, that people sometimes are afterthoughts, that reasonable adjustments aren't made for people, and that some of it relates to attitude as well. So of those deaths, we know that before the pandemic, 1,200 deaths were avoidable, and there were a higher proportion of those that were taking place in healthcare settings and related to healthcare than there were for the general population, which suggests that people weren't getting the treatment that they should have, and as a result, were dying.
One of the most significant concerns that you raise within your witness statement relates to critical care guidance, and whether that had a bearing on the outcomes of people with learning disabilities. If we could take a look at the critical care guideline, which NICE produces, INQ 304743001. The inquiry has looked at it before, but I just want to give you the opportunity to explain from MENCAP's perspective what your concerns were. If we could go to the next page of this guidance, please. Yes, there we can see the criteria that was being proposed as to how to assess adults upon admission to hospital. Can you just explain in your own words what the concerns were from MENCAP's perspective?
Well, this makes it clear that the clinical frailty scale should be applied to all adults, irrespective of age, and that comorbidities, and doctors would consider a learning disability often to be a comorbidity or an underlying health condition, should also be affected. So if you look at the Rockwood scale, which is attached to the clinical frailty scale, that shows very clearly that if you need extra support with your household affairs, your shopping, your bills, maybe taking medication, then you were unlikely to get a ventilator and unlikely to be treated for COVID in hospital. So we saw this came out, this NICE guidance came out on the 20th. We picked up on it.
20th of March?
Yes, 20th of March, yes. We picked up on it on the 22nd of March because the Rockwood scale was published in the Sunday Telegraph. And we were immediately alarmed by it because essentially it meant that most people with a learning disability, even people with mild and moderate needs, would be ineligible for treatment. So we were very concerned. We got hold of NICE. I had multiple emails and also a meeting with Paul Crisp at NICE about this. He said during the course of that they were still firming up how they could get in place a quality impact assessments due to the speed of turning the guidance around. And it was clear to us that people with a learning disability had not been considered as part of this.
And part of the reason for that, I understand, and the inquiry's heard, that the clinical frailty scale is not validated on people under the age of 65 or with long-term stable disabilities. That's right, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. That's the case.
And you mentioned, that can come down, thank you. You mentioned that you were immediately in correspondence with Dr. Paul Crisp. I think that's the director of the Centre of NICE Guidelines, who the inquiry will hear from later on in the week. And is it right that you advised him immediately of the concerns that MenCap had about the content of that guideline?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did. And then we had email exchanges and a meeting as well, because we eventually agreed the changes, which obviously were still put in place. So I must note that even the amended guidance has the same date of the 20th on. But the final email from Paul was on the 31st of March, and that said that he'd made the changes and it was due to go live. But we were also concerned because this had been communicated out quite widely, and we were worried that the genie was out of the bottle, really, and that, you know, it had been in the media. And how was this then going to be communicated to healthcare professionals who were probably working under the assumption that it was policy? And we saw this. We saw this during the course of that week. So on the 24th of March, some of our services alerted us to the fact that they were receiving letters dated the 24th of March that essentially said, if anyone in your service gets COVID, they're unlikely to be treated, and therefore please don't bring them to hospital.
Thank you. And we'll look at some of the correspondence you refer to later on. But just going back to the engagement you had with Dr. Paul Crisp, you mentioned that after having had some correspondence with you, there were amendments made to the guideline. Her Ladyship has seen the amendments previously, so I don't propose that we go to them, but that they essentially added a number of caveats, didn't they, to use of the clinical frailty scale?
Yes.
And is it right to assume then that prior to the publication of the initial guideline, you were not contacted by NICE or anyone else involved in the publication of that document?
No. And if they had contacted us, we would have helped them and we would have pointed that out. At the same time, I was involved in a working group on the Care Act easements. We turned that round in a week. There were a group of charities like myself and representatives, and we were literally, you know, commenting on things overnight. It didn't slow up the process. We even produced an easy read guide for officials to be able to share on the date of publication. So we would have done everything we possibly could to help NICE get this right, but we weren't asked.
Turning to another of your concerns, that of DNA CPRs, there are three issues I'd like to go through with you. Broadly, they are inappropriate use of DNA CPRs, lack of communication around DNA CPR notices, and the possibility that DNA CPR notices were being confused with do not treat orders.
Yeah.
Am I right that MenCap was made aware early on in the pandemic around particular issues with GP surgeries sending letters to individuals and indeed groups of individuals with learning disabilities indicating that they may want to consider having a DNA CPR?
Yes, we were.
File?
We were, yes. Some of our support workers flagged it. It turned out that there were two letters that we supplied, but those weren't the only ones. People were reporting all over the country getting copies of letters, similar letters. And some other care providers as well that we were in contact with also reported this as well. We also picked up on instances of individual DNA CPRs being applied without proper consultation. So I'll give you two examples of this. One was the parents of a teenage person with a learning disability who got a letter asking them if they'd agree to a DNA CPR for that individual. And the other one was a conversation that happened. Unfortunately, one of our support workers listened in on the call. And it went along the lines of, I'm just calling from the doctors to see if it's okay to put a DNA CPR on your file. And when the person said, what's that? The doctor said, well, it's nothing to worry about, but if something bad happened to you, they wouldn't give you the kiss of life. To which the person replied, well, I wouldn't want that because I might catch COVID. And that was the end of the conversation. And if the support worker hadn't been in the room at the time, that DNA CPR would still be on that person's file.
It follows then, based on what you're saying, that particular concern is a concern about not necessarily, it may well be that there was a concern about the appropriateness or otherwise of a DNA CPR, but that's about the communication of the decision, isn't it?
Well, I think it's both, really, isn't it? I mean, why would you expect in your 40s to have a conversation like that with your GP? And if you think about the fact that this is somebody in authority having this conversation, it's completely out of context. I think it is inappropriate for the conversation to be had in the first place, let alone for it to unfold in the way that it did.
When you say it's inappropriate, that's on the basis, is it, that this individual did not have any other particular concerns, comorbidities, simply they had a learning disability?
Yes, they had a learning disability and they were living in a care setting. So I think there was quite a lot of confusion around that as well, that people with a learning disability live in supported living settings, which are everyday homes. They live everyday, gloriously ordinary lives in everyday homes with 2, 3, 4 people living in the same setting. And these letters were sent as if it was a large care home full of very frail people, and they're not. They're people living everyday lives, working, going out, having fun. Very healthy people, full of independence and possibility.
Can we have a look, please, at one of the letters that you have appended to your witness statement? This is INQ 30505520. And this is a letter that's gone to a number of people, I think a home or a setting, on the 24th of March 2020. And if we could go to the second page under the title Cardiopulmonary Resuscitation, CPR, and just looking at the second paragraph there, it says the chances of success in CPR for a patient with advanced disease or frailty are virtually zero. CPR is therefore not appropriate for the vast majority of these people and should only be attempted if it is considered that it may be successful. For these reasons, many people decide in advance not to have CPR and choose to be allowed to have a natural and peaceful death. That paragraph may seem relatively anodyne, but why was that particularly concerning for you?
Because this letter was sent to a household of people who were not frail and were not at the end of their lives. And I think this is the issue here, that there was a blanket assumption that anyone that got care and anyone who had a learning disability had a comorbidity or was frail, and therefore advanced care planning should be applied.
Going back to something you said earlier, this letter was sent on the 24th of March 2020.
Yes.
The guidance from NICE was published on the 20th of March 2020. Is it right that you had some concerns that the production of these letters had, whether directly or not, been influenced by the publication of that guidance?
I do. And I think around that time we had the message to protect the NHS. And I think that led to the clinical frailty scale. This was all about relieving pressure on hospitals. And if you were a GP and you looked at that clinical frailty scale, and actually these letters have text to that effect, that actually there's no point this person going to hospital because they're not going to get any treatment. So we may as well apply a do not resuscitate notice, and then we'll give them palliative care at home. And I think that was the thought process. So I think we ran very quickly from we're going to protect the NHS to NICE issuing the guidelines and those being communicated out to, and everybody was working at speed and under a huge amount of pressure. But then GPs thinking actually that it's in people's best interests to send these letters and to apply the DNA CPRs. And if they didn't send the letters, they were increasing the number of DNA CPRs that existed. And we also had cases where old DNA CPRs were brought into play, and people refused conveyance to hospital on the basis that when they had a broken ankle 10 years beforehand, a DNA CPR had been put in place. And so you can also see how these were then confused with treatment. So, whilst actually, intervention, intubation, CPR in its true sense is maybe something that people might not want to avoid, it doesn't mean that they are signing away their rights to any treatment at all. And that's in practice what was happening, that people were not getting treatment, they were not getting conveyance to hospital.
A point of clarification, Ms O'Sullivan. The inquiry heard from Mr Stringer on behalf of the Disability Charities Consortium a couple of weeks ago, and he said there was evidence from MENCAP of a GP applying blanket notices to people then under the care of a MENCAP institution. Those were his words. Is that the sort of thing that we just saw in that letter? Is that what he was referring to?
Yes, that's the sort of thing. And there were obviously other letters and also phone calls as well. Can I just again as a point of clarification, we don't have any institutions. We campaigned heavily to get rid of institutions successfully, and these are social care services, everyday homes. The word institution conveys an idea of an isolated hospital, and that's absolutely not the case.
The point you're making really is that these individuals are living ordinary lives, albeit supported by carers. Absolutely, yes. Typically, it will be a normal house, everyday house. There will be a team of carers that might go in and out during the day. Some people only get a few hours a week. Some people might have 24/7 care. Some people might have someone sleep on site just in case there's a problem in the night. But it very much is, it's ordinary people in ordinary homes. Finally, on this topic, can we please go to Ms O'Sullivan's statement, paragraph 16? And I'm not sure if I read this out before, but it's INQ 30479-878, and we're looking here at paragraph 16. And an example that you've given of something else happening in relation to communication around DNA CPRs. And I'm just reading from the second sentence where it says, in one such case, the person we supported was admitted into hospital on the 31st of March 2020 due to sepsis diagnosed by the GP. He was in hospital for 5 days and was successfully treated. On arrival back to his home, which was a supported living service, staff discovered a DNA CPR form at the bottom of his bag. There was no reason stated for its issue. The person had no pre-existing health conditions and was in good health prior to his admission for sepsis. The team who supported him were not contacted with regards to the DNA CPR decision, and the person would not have had capacity to make the decision if an attempt to discuss it with him was made. So how did you then come to be aware of this particular incident?
Well, this would have come through our teams, and we had multiple cases like this. We also got examples through our helpline and families contacting us asking for support and advice. So in March 2020, we had a bereaved family saying that their loved one had not received any treatment whilst in hospital, and that a DNA CPR had been applied without their knowledge. And had been done so according to their functional status because they were dependent on care. So this, to me, suggests a real link with the clinical frailty scale, which clearly said, the Rockwood scale, and the article in the Sunday Telegraph clearly said, if you are level 5 or above, you are not likely to get treatment for COVID. And level 5 was someone who needs a bit of additional help with their shopping, their household finances, their medication. That's the majority of people with a learning disability.
Focusing, though, on the communication around these decisions, who would you have expected to have been contacted to discuss the decision to provide a DNA CPR to this individual?
Well, firstly, if the individual lacks capacity, then it would be their families, and if the family wasn't around, then it would be carers. So we would have expected conversations with, and it may be that the hospital would have attempted to have a conversation with the individual, and the team might have facilitated and helped that in terms of communication. But what was happening was that even where there was one case where a family member was asked, she said she needed to go away and consult her mother and her sister about it. Before she even had a couple of hours to do so, the sister was denied a routine scan in hospital that then resulted in her death a few days later. And when the family asked for an investigation, it was shown that there was a do not attempt resuscitation notice on the patient's file that they had not agreed to, but the records suggested that the sister had. And that was quite common as well. So families were left with the grief of losing somebody, but also an insinuation that they had actually agreed to something that they felt very strongly they hadn't.
That can come down. Are you aware that NHS England did put out a bulletin, a primary care bulletin, on the 8th of April 2020, reiterating the key principles around DNA CPRs, that it needs to be an individual assessment and preferences must be taken into account, and that blanket DNA CPRs are not appropriate?
Yes, and we pushed for that, and we also pushed for the letter that went from Claire Murdoch to PCTs on the 3rd of April as well. So I must say, when we raised things, people were responsive and tried to put them right, but I do think the genie was out of the bottle.
Turning to a different topic, the impact of infection prevention and control measures on those with learning disabilities. Can you explain your concerns in particular about the restrictions on visiting and how they impacted those who MenCap support?
Absolutely. So family members and carers are absolutely vital for people with a learning disability. And it was treated a little as if it was a nice to have in some instances, and people were denied access. But it's absolutely important. People can help with communication. We see a lot of diagnostic overshadowing, people not displaying pain in the same way that perhaps you might expect from a member of the general public. And also family members have a lot of information about the way that their loved one behaves in stressful situations. So actually visiting wasn't just something that would provide reassurance for the family member and the individual, but it was absolutely vital if the care was to be successful. And we know that anyway. We've campaigned for a long time on reasonable adjustments and the right for families and carers to be listened to. So what we saw were people going into hospital in distress. The distress was exacerbated because they were alone. There was no one to help interpret what their needs were. In some instances, they weren't allowed to take hospital passports because paper wasn't allowed in.
And just pausing there to explain what a hospital passport is.
A hospital passport is a document that would set out your needs if you were admitted to hospital, and we encourage everyone with a learning disability to create one. It will set out your communication preferences, it will set out medications, dietary requirements, things like that. But also it will say if you don't exhibit pain in the same way that a healthcare professional might expect you to. And it will give clinicians, the idea is that it will help clinicians assess you. So I'll give you an example of what happened here. In March 2020, we had an individual of 49 years old with Down syndrome who had never been alone in their life, ever. The family were barred from visiting. They didn't have a hospital passport. The person died, and then the family were called and informed that they passed away. Another one, in one of our settings, there was a person with a chest infection that was resistant to antibiotics. She was taken into hospital, put on a COVID ward, but repeatedly tested negative for COVID. And eventually she was given the antibiotics and started to recover. The team called the hospital every day. They weren't successful in speaking to people. On the fourth day they were, and the hospital team asked why the patient wasn't speaking to them, to which they replied, it's because she's non-verbal. And the hospital for 4 days had no idea that the patient couldn't communicate with them verbally. She then was discharged 2 days later, and she was covered in bruises, and traumatised, and we had no idea what had happened. The team think that they also didn't realise she wasn't able to take her wheelchair with her in the ambulance, and the team think that they didn't realise that she was immobile as well, and probably got her to try and walk.
And is this an issue that arose from this individual not having a passport, or is it an issue that she wasn't allowed to bring it in?
She wasn't allowed to bring it in, so she had one, but she wasn't allowed to take it. And the team weren't allowed to accompany her, and they weren't allowed to visit her. And there was very poor communication between the hospital and the team.
Is it right? Are you aware that eventually the guidance did change? I think it was in October of 2020 to allow visitors to accompany those with learning disabilities.
Yes. So there was on the 25th of March, we were told no visitors. On the 9th of April, some exemptions were made, but it wasn't clear or clear enough. And then in May, it was reissued, and it was much clearer. But even then, it wasn't always accepted by hospitals and nursing staff.
You also raise a concern in your witness statement on a very similar note about the wording of ambulance guidance in relation to conveyance to hospital. If we could please show on screen INQ 30498-063. And I'm looking here at the heading 10.2, using the most appropriate conveying resource, and the second bullet point up from the bottom, where it says non-essential persons. Non-essential persons such as observers, family members, are not to travel with the patient compartment with a suspected or confirmed case unless the patient is a child who requires conveyance. I'm just going to pause there. There's obviously an exception there for a child. Does it follow that you would have expected there to also have been an exception for example,
absolutely.
a person with a learning disability?
Yeah, absolutely. It would be a reasonable adjustment that should have been made and should have been respected despite the circumstances of the pandemic.
And is the issue with this particular guidance that the phrasing non-essential is really open to significant interpretation as to whether or not a carer is or is not, or a family member is or is not essential to that individual?
Yes. And I believe that's how it ended up being poorly applied, even after the guidance had been clarified, that it was the what constitutes an essential person.
If that can come down, is it right you campaigned to have this guidance changed?
Yes, we did.
And did it change?
Yes, it did. But we still had issues where people were using the old guidance and interpreting this wrongly.
And given the number of issues which MenCap has raised in terms of the way in which guidance was produced and the wording of that guidance, is there any thought from your perspective about the involvement that MenCap has, or individual organisations such as MenCap has, in the production of guidance going forward?
Well, this is the thing that really, if anyone had asked, if anyone had shown us this guidance, we would have happily looked at it and we would have happily advised on it. And I think we could have avoided a lot of these issues had that happened. So we know that in slower time, we would expect to actually co-produce things with people with a learning disability and really but in the absence of, and at speed, we do have colleagues with a learning disability who gladly look at guidance, turn around easy reads. We have lots of policy experts who are who can help and support. So even in the times when everything was so pressured and we were operating at speed, we could have helped with a lot of these things.
Did you also have concerns about the use of PPE and its impact on those with learning disabilities in healthcare settings?
Yes, I mean, obviously, PPE reduces people's ability to take verbal or visual clues from the way people are presenting and talking, and especially compounded with if you're in hospital. It's a frightening experience at the best of times. You don't necessarily understand what's happening to you, what's going on. And then if you're approached by strangers wearing masks, you can't pick up on visual clues in terms of smiling and things like that. So it absolutely did. And it's important to note that PPE was also used in social care settings for a very long time after it was no longer required in healthcare settings. And again, that was problematic for people in terms of communication. So yes, absolutely, it was an issue.
And Lady, I'm going to turn to a slightly different
Yes, of
topic,
course,
so that may be an
certainly.
appropriate time.
I hope you're warned that we break at this stage for lunch.
Yes.
Are you okay to come back this afternoon?
Yes, absolutely, yes.
I shall return at 2:05.